All right. Thank you very much again. Christian.
Thank you all so much for coming out. I appreciate it a lot. I'm Christian Watson. I am the campus coordinator for the Students for Liberty, which is running this event. The title of this talk is called Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myth of Progressivism, which is Mr. Reed's book. And so if you have any issue or you just want to engage what he said, then the Q&A session will be open. It'll be long enough, and I hope you guys indulge in it. Lawrence Reed is the president of the Foundation for Economic Education. Previously, Mr. Reed served as the president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan for 20 years and taught economics full-time from 1977 to 1984. Mr. Reed has authored over 1,000, I hear it's over nearly 2,000 now, newspaper columns and articles. His work has appeared in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, the USA Today, Baltimore Sun, Detroit News, and Detroit Free Press, among many others. He has authored or co-authored 8 books, one of which is the title of this talk. And his most recent book is Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage and Conviction, Courage, Character, and Convention. Please introduce Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me all right? Is this working okay? Okay, terrific. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I have to say that it's taken me 9 years to get to Macon. I moved to Georgia 9 years ago this month, and this is my first visit to Macon and to Mercer University, so I'm delighted to be here. I apologize for my voice. I hope I sound better to you than I do to me. I have a very mild cold, but only in the last hour or so have I noticed that it's settled in my voice. So maybe if I get going and warmed up, it'll improve. Before I get into the talk tonight, I certainly want to say a word or two about the organization that I lead. It's called the Foundation for Economic Education. We have a website, FEE.org, where we post every day of the week 4, 5, sometimes 6 brand new pieces. We have about 70 years of archived material on the website, easily searchable. But our focus is on high school and college students. And our mission is to inspire them in ideas of individual liberty, free markets, and personal character, and the intersection of those things with each other. And because you're only, about a 3-hour drive from Atlanta? My home is in Newton, and it was only a couple hours, but I think to Atlanta, maybe you could be there in about 3 hours. You might be especially interested in the biggest event of the year that we put on in Atlanta in June. It's June 13 through 15. It's called FEECon, and there'll be this year at least 1,000 students, college students from all over the world who will be at that. Last year we had about 30% of the attendees coming from outside the United States, from countries as far away as Nepal. Can you believe that? In the Himalayas. Somebody came all that way to attend the conference. A lot from Latin America and Western Europe, and some from Africa and Asia as well. So there is information on the website about FEECon now, but we'll be adding a lot to it as we nail down additional speakers and events over the next few weeks. Okay, tonight I'm going to talk to you about the subject of one of the books I've written called Excuse Me, Professor. Oh, by the way, in Brazil, I didn't know this, it wasn't with my approval, but they just came out with a new edition of it in Brazil, translated into Portuguese, but they changed the title. It's called, in Portuguese, Excuse Me, Socialist. So I'll leave that up to you to decide whether that was a good choice or not, but they say that it's selling well. But the original book, that came out in 2014, includes 50 chapters, and each one is a misconception or an error that people who would call themselves typically progressives support or believe, and each chapter then responds to that. So I'm just going to pick a few of the topics among the 50 in that book and tell you something about the myth and how I would respond to it. Christian in particular asked me to be sure to cover one involving one of the great companies in American history and one of the great entrepreneurs of our history. And the company is the Standard Oil Company, and the great entrepreneur who founded it is John D. Rockefeller. Now, the typical progressive, because a progressive is not nearly as friendly to markets and entrepreneurs as, say, I would be critical of John D. Rockefeller in Standard Oil. They would, in fact, the more radical of them would say the Standard Oil Company is an example of why you have to have strong antitrust laws to break up big companies and so forth, and that Rockefeller was not a hero but a villain. Well, I believe just the opposite, and the research I did convinced me of that all the more. Let me start explaining the background here and the points about Standard I'd like to raise by asking you, do you know what Americans used to light their homes up until the middle part of the 19th century, until the discovery of oil from beneath the surface of the earth? What were we burning in our homes to provide light in, say, the first half of the 19th century? Anybody know? Whale oil. Nobody uses that anymore for lighting anyway, except maybe a few Eskimos, perhaps, I don't know, or people living in the far north of Norway or places like that. But around the world, whale oil is rarely, if ever, used these days as a source of lighting, and yet that's how we lit our homes, clear up until really the second half of the 19th century. But here was the problem. Whales were owned not by anybody in particular, or anybody even in general. They were not owned at all. They were sort of common property. And as a result, you got what economists call the tragedy of the commons. If something is held in common or is owned by nobody, well then nobody really has a direct and immediate incentive to take care of that resource. They may have a stronger incentive to simply use it and even abuse it. But if you can't own it, well then what's the use of trying to take care of it? Even if it's physically possible to do it with whales, somebody else could come along and just take your whale. So everybody had an incentive to use whales and whale oil, but nobody had either the technology or the incentive to try to husband them like we do, say, with cattle on farms. But as populations increased and economies improved in the early half of the 19th century, the demand for whale oil went through the roof. But nothing was happening on the supply side. They weren't owned, so you couldn't breed more whales. I mean, that's entirely up to Mother Nature. So demand soared, supply really wasn't changed by any human effort. So what do you suppose was happening to the price of whale oil during the first decades of the 19th century? As demand went up and the supply didn't change much at all. Prices went through the roof. And at that time, we didn't have a federal Department of Energy to sort of take a problem and manage it forever instead of trying to solve it, as they, I think, usually do. They usually manage them rather than solve them, I should say. So prices went up as a natural market response to rising demand and a stagnant supply. At that time, we didn't have either a Department of Energy or price controls. Prices were free to go wherever supply and demand would take them. So as the price rose, it had a couple important effects. On the demand side, as whale oil prices went up, you had some people, not everybody, but some people facing the higher price thought, well, you know, maybe I should try to conserve. Maybe I should do my reading during the daylight hours instead of at night. Or I think I've got a candle or two up in the attic. Maybe I'll dig that out and use that instead of whale oil. So demand was curtailed to some degree as the price went up. Not everybody can do that, though. But the more significant effect was on the supply side. As the price went up, this was the market's way of sending a signal. Hey, you know, that people need and want to have their homes lighted, but this stuff that they're using is increasingly scarce relative to demand. So there's money to be made if somebody finds an alternative. This is how the price system works. As the price goes up, you have entrepreneurs who come out of the woodwork. Sometimes they are working out of their garage and have nothing to start with. Other times they may be within a big company doing something totally different, but they see an opportunity. So entrepreneurs started to look into this, thinking that, hey, if we can find an alternative to whale oil that's feasible, economical, there's money to be made here. Well, in 1859, an oil rush began. And it all began in Titusville, Pennsylvania, a little town in northwestern Pennsylvania. Because for years, on Oil Creek, as it was called, in northwestern Pennsylvania, and a few of the other streams up there, there was this awful black stuff that would come to the surface. And local Indians would use it for paint and so forth. But nobody really realized at first that it had other uses. But somebody discovered that, hey, this stuff will burn. And maybe we can improve it so that it will burn more cleanly. But we don't know where it's coming from. It's on the creeks. Presumably it's coming from in the ground somewhere, but is it in large enough quantity, and can you bring it forth? That was yet to be found. So a group of Connecticut businessmen sent a guy named Colonel Edwin Drake to Pennsylvania. They gave him some money, some venture capital, and said, you go see if you can find where this stuff is coming from, and if somehow we can get it forth in enough quantity that maybe it'll be a viable alternative to whale oil. Maybe we can make a few bucks here. And Colonel Drake believed very strongly that it was in the ground in probably large pools, maybe under pressure, and if you just drill deep enough, you could tap into it, and it might come gushing forth. There was no proof of that until he proved it. And he spent all the money that the Connecticut business people gave him, and they gave up. They said, forget it, doesn't look like you're going to find it, come on back, we're not going to throw any more money at this. And then he went out and borrowed another $500 of his own money, and it was about gone when, in 1859, he struck oil. And it was a classic gusher. Fortunately, there were photographers, and some of the original pictures still survive. You can see for several hundred feet this stuff poured forth from the earth until they could cap it. And that started the oil rush, which began in Pennsylvania, spread to Ohio later, and of course, decades later to places like Texas. But at first, it was in Pennsylvania. Everybody and their brother, it seemed. This is, in fact, the very phrase that John D. Rockefeller will later use in testimony before Congress. He said, everybody and their brother, it seemed, were getting into the oil business at that time. I've seen pictures, by the way, of mountainsides in western Pennsylvania from the 1860s and 70s. And if you look at them from a bit of a distance, it looks like heavily wooded mountains. Then you look close and you realize those aren't trees anymore, they're oil derricks. They were punching holes all through the ground to try to tap into this stuff. Many of the wells didn't produce. There were a lot of people who got into the business not knowing much, just trying it out, and see if they could get lucky. Didn't make it. Lots of people were trying. But there was a booming oil business, lots of small companies by the 1860s trying to find this stuff. And then once they found it, they had to somehow improve it. If you just burned it as it was found in the ground, it was pretty dirty stuff, very smoky. So there was an ongoing effort by these companies to try to refine it, improve it until you could get it to burn cleanly. That will continue, of course, for decades. Well, into this jungle of competitors, in 1865, emerges this young man named John D. Rockefeller. And we are so accustomed to hearing the name Rockefeller associated with great wealth, you may be assuming that he was a wealthy man in 1865, but he wasn't. He was in his 20s. He was a bookkeeper. He was a grocer. He was a Sunday school teacher. But that's it. He didn't have much money at all. He didn't inherit a nickel. But he saw an opportunity, and this is what entrepreneurs do. An entrepreneur is somebody who not only sees an opportunity, lots of people see them, but an entrepreneur takes the extra step. He has the courage, or she has the courage to act, to take a risk, to see if they can make something of it. Rockefeller had that. And so he saw an opportunity. He formed a partnership in 1865 in the oil refining business, and later in 1870, he formally created the Standard Oil Company. In that first year, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Company had just 4% of the market for refined oil products, okay, which was pretty much one big one and a handful of derivatives. What was the main product that they were making out of this crude oil? Anybody? To use to light our homes? Kerosene. That was what they were making out of that crude oil. He had 4% of the kerosene market in 1870 in his first year as Standard Oil Company. But in 1890, 20 years later, he had 90% of the kerosene market. And some people say, well, obviously, he was a monopolist. Nobody should have 90% of any particular market. He must have gotten that big because he did some harm to somebody, if not his customers, and surely his competitors. Well, in my belief, there are two kinds of monopoly. Okay? One is called an efficiency monopoly. That's a company that gets a high market share because it does the best job. Kodak, for years, sold overwhelmingly, like 80–90% of all the film in the country. It was an efficiency monopoly. It didn't have any special privileges from the government. There were opportunities for anybody to compete, but Kodak was just the best when it came to film. As you know, you can be the best for a while, but in relatively free markets, somebody's always nipping at your heels, and Kodak eventually actually declared bankruptcy because they didn't see the digital age coming as other competitors did, and so they beat them at their own game. But for a while, Kodak had an efficiency monopoly. It was the best in the business. Everybody bought Kodak film because they loved it. They always innovated. They were improving the quality of the film. That's an efficiency monopoly, and I firmly believe that an efficiency monopoly, if it decides to do you harm, if it decides, oh, we're big now, we can start abusing our customers, we can raise prices and cut corners on service and that kind of thing, all they're doing is hanging out a sign that says competitors want it, because that's exactly what they'll get. They have to keep doing the excellent things that gave them a high market share, or in free markets, they will lose that high market share. So I don't worry much about efficiency monopolies. It's the other kind of monopoly I think we should be concerned about, and that is a coercive monopoly. This is one that gets a high market share because it gets some special privilege from government. It could be in the form of a subsidy that it gets, but the little guys don't. It could be favorable tax treatment that benefits it, but aren't distributed to competitors. It may be even, it may go so far as the government saying, we'll make sure nobody can compete with you. We'll throw them behind bars if they try. Various degrees of this, or it could even be in the form of a tariff, where the government says, we'll protect you from foreign competition by slapping tariffs on companies from overseas that produce the same thing. There are a lot of ways you can get a coercive monopoly. But this is one to be concerned about because it rests upon the use of government power to either punish competitors or force customers to buy or things like that. Rockefeller Standard Oil was clearly in the first category. He was constantly improving the quality of kerosene. The kerosene of 1890 was so much better than the kerosene of 1870, burned so much more cleaner. But the most dramatic thing that Rockefeller did was to cut the price. If he was the traditional boogeyman monopolist, you'd expect to see kerosene prices going through the roof at some point. But they fell steadily. When he entered the market, it was 45 cents a gallon. By 1890, we're out there at 90% of the market, it's down to 6 cents a gallon. And within a few years, it'll be 3 cents a gallon. He brought a steadily improving quality product to more and more people, and he was competing not only in the domestic American market, but world markets as well. The Russians were finding oil and entering world markets. Lots of people were. He had to look around his shoulder all the time at competitors. In fact, even in 1890, when he had 90% of the kerosene market, there were 66 other companies competing with him. Now, All told, they only made up 10% of the market, so they're tiny. But you look at those companies of 1890, some of them are the big ones of a few years later. The Sun Oil Company, the Pure Oil Company, they're getting their start a little later than Rockefeller, but they will grow too and continue to compete intensively with him. So from a consumer standpoint, it's kind of hard to argue with what Rockefeller did. Prices are not secret. We know what people were paying for kerosene, and we know what the quality was. The price went down and the quality went up, all during the time that customers were rewarding him by saying, we want your stuff. Yours is the best. We'll buy it. Better than anybody else was offering. And yet you have some people to this day who say, well, but he was so big, he must have done some harmful things. I want to quickly touch on, I don't want to spend too much time on just this myth, but I want to touch on at least a couple or three of the charges often leveled against him. You have people who say, I've seen it in history books without any evidence. They just say, well, we just know he did it, but we won't provide any evidence. One charge is, well, he engaged in predatory price cutting. He cut the price in an effort to drive competitors out of the market so that later, when they're gone, he was able then to raise it. Well, John McGee, a professor at the University of Chicago years ago, looked at this in depth, published a great article in the October 1958 Journal of Law and Economics, the definitive study of this as regards Standard Oil. And McGee said there's no evidence that he ever did this. We know what the prices were. So we go back and we look to see what people in all markets in the U.S. and abroad were paying for kerosene. The price never spiked. It was declining all the time that he was getting more and more customers. So there's no material evidence that he engaged in predatory price cutting for the purpose of jacking the price up later. It just doesn't seem to have happened. He improved the quality and cut the price. He never raised it again. But even if he had tried this, you often hear this raised against other companies. They say, oh, the big companies can do this. It's so easy. They can drive the little guy out. It's a lot harder than you think. Let me quickly diverge and tell you a real-life story that happened about the same time, 1890s, involving the chemical bromine. How many of you have heard of the company, the Dow Chemical Company? Just about everybody, right? Dow, one of the biggest chemical manufacturers. Its founder was a guy, I know this because he founded the Dow Chemical Company in the town, Midland, Michigan, where I lived for 30 years, so lots of people knew this story. He was a chemist who knew that there was a world market for this particular chemical called bromine, and he used it making aspirin and a lot of other things. And he devised a way in which bromine could be extracted through the process known as electrolysis from the very briny water that we always had there in mid-Michigan. And he could do it at a very inexpensive cost. The problem was that there were German bromine manufacturers at the time who dominated the world market, and they didn't want to see the price go below 46 cents a pound. When they discovered that Herbert Dow in Midland, Michigan, had plans to sell bromine for less than their 46 cents, they sent a delegation to Michigan to meet with him, and he very famously threw them out of the office physically when they told him, don't you dare sell bromine for less than 46 cents a pound. He wasn't about to listen to these guys. He had an opportunity here. He was going to capitalize on it. So he starts selling bromine at a profit for 36 cents a pound. The Germans decide, we warned him, so let's dump bromine so inexpensively that we'll run him out of business. They cut the price to 15 cents. Everywhere they saw a market for Dow, or where he was selling, they cut the price to 15 cents. Now you might say, well, how's a little guy going to possibly compete with these giant German manufacturers at such a price? He did. He sent agents out into the marketplace. The Germans didn't know they were working for him, but he said, buy up all the 15-cent bromine that those dummies will sell, and we'll just repackage it, put my name on it, and we'll sell it in every market that they're charging more than 15 cents. And the Germans kept saying, where's all this demand coming from? Holy cow, we better meet it, we better step up production and sell it, because if we don't, then that's demand that will go to Herbert Dow. But it was Dow himself who was buying this stuff. The guy who was supposed to be the prey ended up being the predator, until finally the Germans said, we can't do this anymore, we're going broke. And they threw in the towel. And that was a source of much early capital for the expansion of the Dow Chemical Company. The same would have been true for Rockefeller if he had tried to drive 66 other companies out of business by a rock bottom price and then tried to raise it. Well, if 66 companies felt it was worth their while to compete with him at this price, how many would feel it worth their while to compete with him if the price was even higher? So a would-be price-cutting predator finds himself constantly keeping prices at loss-incurring lows in order to prevent the competition that will sooner or later appear anyway. And so John McGee, in that article that I mentioned, said that Rockefeller was not stupid. He knew that that would be a self-defeating policy. He knew that the best way to make the most money was to sell as low a price as you can, but make a profit and improve the quality. And that's precisely what he did. Another charge is, oh, well, he bought up competitors. That's how he got big. Every time he saw a competitor, he made a deal and bought them up, okay, so they wouldn't compete with him. How long could you survive in business if you just spend money buying up competition and then shutting it down? I mean, you could buy up the other 66 companies, and you'd have 66 more knocking on your door. People building refineries saying, hey, I don't even have to know how to run it. I'll just threaten Rockefeller and he'll buy me out. I mean, this is ridiculous to think you can eliminate competition by buying it. It just continues. The more you buy, the more you have to buy, because others will reappear. So that's a red herring. And then you have the charge that, well, he conspired and he colluded with his competitors to raise price. Okay, there's no evidence that this was ever attempted either, or that at least if it was, it never lasted more than a matter of hours. Let's put ourselves in a similar position as he might have faced, Rockefeller, in the 1890s. Okay? We have more than 66 here, but let's say I'm Rockefeller, you're my smaller competitors, and I've gotten us together in our secret hideaway. Okay, and we're all complaining about what? Prices are too low. Wouldn't we like to get our prices higher? Right? So here's how we propose to fix that. I'm going to say to all of you, I think we can't get a higher price unless we restrict our production. Right? We can't put as much stuff out there and expect the price to stick. We're going to make prices go up, we got to restrict our production. So I propose that all of us restrict our production by 10%. And then with less supply in the market, the price will go up and we'll get more. Of course, we won't have as much to sell, but at least we'll get a higher price. Are you going to be quick to say yes? I don't think so, because some of you are going to say, wait a minute, John D., 10% for you is not the same as 10% for me. I'm smaller, I'm newer, you've got more advantages, and blah, 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 blah. So you should cut your production by 10%, but I should only have to cut mine by 5%. Right? Because if the price is going up, I don't want to cut production, I'd like to sell even more. So everybody has an incentive to kind of cheat on the agreement, even if we arrive at one. In fact, if I thought I could get all of you to agree to restrict your production and raise your price, I would say, great, we got a deal, shake hands, and then I'd get on the phone and I'd call all your customers. And I'd say, hey, don't tell anybody, but you're soon going to hear about the price going up. But if you buy from me instead of who you've been buying for, I'll give you a discount. In other words, the very reason for creating the secret agreement in the first place, to make more money, becomes the reason for breaking it. In this case, it kind of pays to cheat on the agreement, to hope the other guy sticks with it, but you don't have an intention of. We've even found this to be the case constantly with OPEC, which is an oil-producing cartel of governments who have the taxpayer to lean on if they have to. They're not a for-profit private company that can go belly up. And yet they still undercut each other all the time. They arrive at agreements, think they've got a deal, and then secretly they're undercutting each other all the time. So it's very difficult to make those kinds of things stick. And in Rockefeller's case, there's no indication that any such agreements ever did. Well, I spent a lot of time on that one myth, but I hope I've given you some food for thought anyway, maybe a different perspective than you might have heard or read about heretofore. But the book, Excuse Me, Professor, deals with, as I say, 50, and I want to pick a couple or three more. How about this one? I'm going to pick this even though I have no idea, of course, where any of you are coming from on religious matters, and it doesn't matter for the purposes of this talk. I just want to respond to something you often hear, and that is that Jesus was a socialist. How many have heard some version of that before? Yeah, so I would think whether you're a Christian or not, you should be interested in, well, what's the fact of this? Did he say something that would suggest he would be supportive of what we call socialism today? I don't think at all. But you have to begin with some kind of description. What is socialism? And that's not easy. You know why? Because socialists are fond of saying, okay, we set up shop over here, now we're going to try it. And then it flops, and then they say, oh, well, that wasn't it at all. You know, we're going to try it next time. And so it's just endless, like Venezuela. That was going to be a great socialist experiment. Now it's a flop. 3.5 million people have fled the country. The economy's gone from the richest in Latin America to the poorest. And now what do so many of the socialists say? Oh, well, they didn't do it right. You know, it wasn't really socialism. Well, we'll get it right next time. They've been saying that for 5,000 years. Socialism attempts to do one, two, or all three of the following things. Okay, this begins to get us close to a definition. Then we can ask ourselves, did Jesus Christ endorse any of those objectives? Socialists intend to redistribute the wealth. That's one of their objectives. And of course, there are degrees of that. Some want to do it radically, some more moderately perhaps, but that is an objective of just about every socialist, to redistribute wealth, take from some and give to others. A second objective is to have government ownership of the means of production. And here there are degrees too. Some socialists, the more radical ones, they want the government to seize and take over and run everything. Others say, no, we'll leave it in private hands, we'll just tell them what to do. Or some mix of the two. But that is an objective, either ownership or control, at least, of the means of production. And then the third objective is central planning of the economy. We want the government to concentrate power and have bureaucrats and politicians who can then instruct the rest of us how to conduct our economic affairs. And socialists try to accomplish one, two, usually all three of those to some degree. The question now is there any endorsement in the words of Jesus in the New Testament that would suggest he was sympathetic? I find none. I have scoured the New Testament multiple times. There is not even the slightest hint from Jesus that he would support the forcible redistribution of wealth. No, he did argue, hey, be kind, be helpful, take care of your kids, help your neighbor, but he never said the way to do that is to get politicians to swipe it from somebody at gunpoint and then give it away. This was something he encouraged from the heart, not at gunpoint. He never talked about government ownership of the means of production, never talked about the need for wise planners playing God to direct the economy. But I want to give you some specific passages from the New Testament that really get to the heart of this. Jesus said on more than one occasion that he came to uphold the law. Now, what he meant by that was the Mosaic law, not every law of every politician, but rather the Mosaic law, the core of which is the Ten Commandments. The 8th and 10th Commandments have a lot to say about things economic. The 8th Commandment says, thou shalt not steal. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless you're just absolutely convinced you could spend it better than the person who earned it. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal, but you could hire a politician to do the stealing for you. It says thou shalt not steal, period. And I'd like to think, if I could take a little literary license here, that maybe when God handed these 10 Commandments to Moses, he added the 10th one as a kind of, hey, if you forgot the 8th already, the 10th says, thou shalt not covet, which is the source of a lot of stealing. Often people steal because they first covet, they first are envious of what someone else has. So there are 2 commandments that Jesus said he came to uphold and reinforce, and yet they would seem to be pro-private property, not pro-state theft of property. There's a passage in the book of Luke where a man comes up to Christ and he says, Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. This is Luke 12:13-15. In other words, the man is saying, I don't think I got a fair shake. The other guy got more than me. Can you use some of your influence or your power to get me a bigger chunk of that pie? Now, Jesus' response is very instructive. He did not say, oh, well, I'll look into it. Maybe you should get more. Oh, he got more than you? Oh, well, clearly that's a bad thing. He immediately rebuked the man for his envy, and he said to him, man, now this is something I wish we could get politicians in Washington to say. Wouldn't this be great? It'd be a new day. But he said to the man, man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Who made me? You want me to divvy up the wealth? Well, that's not my job. Who made me such a divider or judge over people's property? I think that's a strong endorsement not of socialism, but of free markets and private property and personal responsibility and ownership, not of forcible state redistribution. You have the story told by Jesus himself of the Good Samaritan, where, and you all know the story, whether you're a Christian or not, of it, where a man comes across, a traveling person runs across a man who's clearly on the down and outs, maybe he's even been beaten or robbed, he's in bad shape. And what does the man we now know as the Good Samaritan do? Does he say to the man, oh, well, that's not my responsibility, see you later? Or does he say, I'll tell you who your social worker is, you can go see that person. Or maybe there's a program the emperor might have that you can apply for. No, what does he do? He chips in, and he helps, and he does it with his own resources, his own time. That's why we call him the Good Samaritan. If he'd done any of those other things, we wouldn't know him as the Good Samaritan today. We'd know him as the good-for-nothing Samaritan. The guy who came upon someone in need and didn't feel it was important enough to help him out, instead just threw it off on the back of the taxpayer somehow. That's a good-for-nothing, not a Good Samaritan. And there's also a passage in the Bible that progressives and socialists like to seize upon. They say, what about when he drove the money changers from the temple? That would seem to suggest he didn't like capitalists and people who were trying to make money. He drove the money changers from the temple. Now, how you go from that to socialism, beyond me. But you have to look at the context. Where were these people doing their thing? Selling trinkets and changing money. Where were they doing it? Were they doing it in a market or a bank? Jesus never drove a money changer from a market or a bank, but he drove them from God's temple. It would be like you showing up at a funeral with a kazoo playing Happy Days Are Here Again. You know, somebody's going to say, hey, this is not the place for that. Get out. That's what he was doing. He never drove a money changer from where they ought to be, in the marketplace or a bank or some such place. So I think there's much more I could say about that, but I think maybe that's enough to at least get you thinking that the idea that he was some kind of a socialist, that he would favor the forcible employment of police and the whole apparatus of government to redistribute wealth and take your factory is ridiculous. It's absurd. Another myth concerns a policy issue that we are debating all the time today, and that's the minimum wage. You turn on the TV and just watch a half-hour news. It's almost every day somebody is saying we need to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Many of the candidates for president are going to be running on that as a platform. $15, basically a doubling of today's legal minimum wage. the idea behind it is that, well, if people are not making a lot of money, we can change that by just decreeing that they be paid a lot of money, or more anyway. We just pass a law. We just make it illegal for anybody to pay less than $15 an hour. But you realize that that is kind of like that's fanciful magic thinking. This is the idea that there's no, let me put it in the form of a question. Do you believe, does anybody here believe that every single job of any kind, anywhere, and every single person is automatically worth to an employer $15 an hour? There's no such thing as a person or a job that's only worth $10 an hour. That's absurd. There are lots of things and lots of people, because of maybe lack of experience, lack of skills, they're just starting out, don't have references, they're young, they may only command $7, $8 in a job. But usually that isn't their lifetime employment. It's a start. And they go from there, learning some skills, and go on and make more over time. Most people at $7 an hour are not 60-year-old rocket scientists. They're usually young, inexperienced, or in a depressed economy, inner city, let's say, and where jobs just don't command $15 an hour. So what's the effect then of passing a law that says if you can't find a job that pays at least $15 an hour, you're not allowed to work? That's what the minimum wage does. What's the effect of that? Do employers say, this guy's only worth about 10 to me, so I'd lose $5 an hour if I hire him, but I'll hire him anyway and just eat the loss? Does any employer do that? Would you do that? Not for long, you go broke. So what's the effect of a law that says 15, anything less is illegal? It's unemployment among the very people you're most interested in wanting to help, because you've driven them out of the labor market. You've priced them out of the labor market by declaring, if $15 an hour makes people richer, well, why settle with 15? Why not make it 30? Why not make it 50? $100 an hour. Make everybody rich by a wave of the wand in Washington. This is not economics. This is magic wand stuff from fantasy films. But yet that's what they talk about in Washington. They can posture as, well, I'm a friend of the working poor because I want to give them a higher wage. No, you want to put them out of work is what you want to do. Just at a time in their life when in many cases they're trying to get a start. You're going to price them right out of the labor market. And that's why I always would like to say, why don't you just butt out and leave other people to their own private contractual arrangements? They didn't ask you for your opinion, let alone your club and your cops, to tell them that they could or could not work in a certain way. Well, maybe there's 3 myths for you. There are 47 others in the book. Christian, you think I should end there or throw in another quick one?
Quick, like 5 minutes.
A quick one? Okay, how about, hey, how many have heard of Upton Sinclair and the Jungle? Okay, yeah, this is one of my favorites. And I'm guessing that most of you who raised your hand probably learned from somebody that Upton Sinclair exposed terrible practices in the meat packing industry in Chicago, and they were so awful, companies were taking their meat and selling it to consumers, and we had to have government regulation to stop that. Didn't you hear some version of that? That's what I learned. And then I decided in my 30s that I was going to look into it. And one of the first things I wanted to find out was Sinclair, in this book, which was a novel, incidentally, not a documentary, it's only a few pages in there of the whole novel that focuses on meat packing in Chicago. But he talks about men falling into the vats and being ground up and into sausage and being served to the public. And I thought, okay, that should be easy to prove, right? The newspapers at the time should have been full of stories about, what happened to this or that guy. Wouldn't somebody be out there saying, hey, what happened to Bob? Boy, here's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Jim never showed up. Well, I guess we'll just eat them for supper tonight. I mean, surely we can go back and find who were these people. I challenge anybody, because I tried. There were such people. It never happened. And yet, you'd think if it did, their names would be known, there'd be monuments to them, there'd be martyrs to the progressive cause. But instead, this myth is just perpetuated in textbooks as part of an argument for government to be in charge, government regulation. I guarantee you, any meat packer that was caught grinding up their employees and serving them to their customers would go out of business in no time. They'd be hit with so many lawsuits, it would be unbelievable. And yet this is presented today as if, oh, well, see, we can't let the big guys do that to people. Just, the real world doesn't work that way. But there's so much more to that story, but I just want to tell you, be skeptical of some of these crazy myths that get, especially if there's an agenda behind them. We're trying to push more government, so we have to have villains. We have to make people look like dirt so we can say, see, we need regulation. Well, some of it's real, but a lot of it isn't. With that, I'm happy to open it up to questions for the balance of our time. Thank you for being so attentive.
Good man, everyone. I'm just going to hold the microphone around. If you want to ask him a question, raise your hand right now. All right. And then you'll be. Keep questions brief, please.
Can I ask the first question?
Sure.
Okay, so I've done a lot of thinking with minimum wage. Do you think and there's arguments for minimum wage causing inflation and all that stuff. So do you think minimum wage is the causation for inflation? Or, because right now we're seeing in America prices of goods are increasing while, the prices of wages are just staying stagnant.
Yeah.
So.
On the surface, it would look as though when you mandate that higher wages be paid, that would be inflationary. But actually, if the government doesn't print any more money so that all the higher wages can be paid, what you end up with is not higher inflation, you just have higher unemployment. So some people, a company may say, okay, I got to pay 15, so I got to give some of my employees a hike from, say, 9 or 10 up to 15. And I got to have employees, I'll have to find some way to pay it. And then they start thinking, okay, well, I don't need to pay somebody to sweep the floor. That was a $7 job, I'll just do it myself. Or I'll automate with kiosks, and we'll just have machines replace what humans used to do. There are various ways you can get around it. So, while it may cause certain prices to go up to some degree, I don't think the minimum wage causes general inflation. It's usually offset by higher unemployment.
Hi, if you give me, I just want to remind every student that there are sign-in sheets before you leave, especially my students. Sign in, okay? Quick one. Doesn't Jesus say something like, it'd be easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle?
Yes.
It's kind of, seemed like he didn't like the wealthy man.
That's right. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. That sounds like, and the progressives love to say, see, he's saying that rich people are bad. What he's saying, and when you realize, hey, is this supportable by anything else he said, then you realize the context. What he's saying is, with riches come temptation. There are good people who are rich, and there are good people who are poor. There are bad people who are rich, and there are bad people who are poor. But in all cases, I'm pretty sure he would say, don't allow your wealth to corrupt your character. It's a challenge. How many times do you see wealthy people actually, turns out they didn't have the character to manage their wealth well. You see this in Hollywood all the time. They're rich, super rich at the age of 20 because they sang at a concert a few times, and now they can't handle life. Okay? Jesus would say, riches are a blessing. Use them appropriately. Don't let them go to your head. Don't be tempted by them. But he never said you shouldn't have them in the first place.
However, greed is one of the 7 deadly sins.
Yes.
So I feel like that's where a lot of the argument comes from, because you're really supposed to live you're supposed to live your life as if you would give your shirt
Yes.
off your back to someone who is poor.
Yes.
So, I really do see the socialist view of it, because if you're looking at it from a capitalist standpoint, you're kind of saying that, you're just giving that person something they can go and get, which is, I feel like there's a lot more to the socialist ideal of seeing Jesus in that form from that point. and that's, yeah. If you have any comments on that?
I understand, but I also think there's a lot more to this business of greed. First of all, it's not easy to define. All of us are motivated in life to behave in a way that improves our well-being, right? That's why you've chosen to come to college, not because you think you going to college will help somebody else you don't know, but because you think it'll help you. Now, you could say, well, that's greedy. Why weren't you thinking of other people? You're just trying to improve yourself. But, so it's a matter of degree. If you are so interested in improving yourself that you never draw the line between free, voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange and high character activity, and you cross the line and actually try to satisfy your desire for things through theft or through deception or through fraud, yeah, I think Jesus and anybody else, reasonable person, would say that there you've carried it too far. It's how you satisfy. But keep in mind, when you look around the world, what gets done in the world that ends up feeding and clothing and housing people? When you look at all the stuff that makes that possible, how much of it comes into being because of somebody's desire to do better versus somebody's desire just to be charitable? The farmers who grow crops, do they do it because they think, oh, I know those kids in that classroom in Macon, Georgia, I don't know them really, but they got to eat, so that's why I'm going to farm. No. People in Brazil plant coffee and end up getting it to your doorstep practically. Is it because they know you or they like you? They don't even know you. They do it because there's something in it for them. So the power of self-interest, when it's not carried to harmful conclusions through things like theft, is what feeds the world. The desire to do better. Thank God we all have that. And if we were all desire, oh, I really don't want to improve myself because that's selfish, well, just, that means you'll never earn enough to help anybody. So you got to earn it and make it, be entrepreneurial before you ever have anything to give anybody. So I would just say it's a matter of degree. And don't let your desire for improvement cross that line to become unethical or to become your central focus. Jesus would say, hey, nothing wrong with it. In fact, remember the parable of the talents, where Jesus tells this story himself. He says, there's a wealthy man who's leaving town for a time, and he trusts his wealth with 3 men, gives them an equal share of it, and says, you take care of it till I get back. Then he comes back, and what does he find? The one guy says, oh, master, look what I did. I preserved it. I don't have a nickel more than you gave me, but at least I preserved it. I buried it in the backyard. The second guy says, no, I actually invested it, and I did pretty well. I got about twice what you gave me. Isn't that great? The third guy makes like 4 times as much. And who in this parable does Jesus praise? The one who didn't turn it into anything? No, he rebukes him. He says, you dummy, you left, I'm paraphrasing. We're going to penalize you, we're going to take that, and I'm going to give it to the third guy. He's the one who knows how to create wealth. So that story alone would make you think, he likes people who create wealth and solve problems and add to society, not subtract from it.
Got another question over here.
Mine's also about the Jesus thing. You said something about how he would be supportive of private property as well, but I do remember one story where a man was like saying, oh, like you seem to be a really good leader, I would want to follow you, but I have to bury my father first so I can get his inheritance and his estate. And Jesus called him really wicked for that and said that, I think basically said that he was going to hell, if I remember correctly, and that he could never be a follower because all he cared about was wealth, and that he didn't care about like that someone who would be a follower of Jesus would just leave their wealth behind and go across.
I'm acquainted with that story. Did you notice, though, that Jesus never said, this is a general principle, everybody should just sell everything? No, he was the Son of God. He knew the guy's heart. He knew the guy wasn't sincere. And he tested him by saying, okay, sell everything. Prove it to me that you really want to be a follower. And it was obvious that he wasn't because he wouldn't go that measure. So I think from that, I don't think you can extrapolate and say, therefore, Jesus is in favor of everybody, even 2,000 years later, just selling everything that they own. it was directed at one particular man whose heart he knew better than anybody else. He was also looking for followers for an early church, knowing that they were up against the Romans and against a lot of other bad habits and faulty ideas. He wanted the earliest church to be as committed as possible because he couldn't afford otherwise. It'd be snuffed out in no time if its followers weren't the best he could find. So that instruction was aimed at one particular person, not all of mankind.
First off, I just wanted to say thank you for coming and speaking. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question deals with minimum wage as well. Perhaps this is common knowledge, but I didn't know this last summer. Seasonal organizations such as camps are not legally obligated to pay minimum wage
Yes.
to their workers. And I took a job unknowingly, and I ended up working 75-hour weeks for less than minimum wage.
Oh, okay.
And I was curious, when I was doing the job, what it would be like to be working 40 hours a week at a low-skilled job and still not have a livable wage. So my question is, do low-skilled laborers deserve a livable wage if minimum wage has not kept pace with price inflation?
Well, I would say that there's nothing fun about working hard and making only $7 or $8 an hour. What's worse than that, though, is making $0 an hour because you've been priced by law out of the labor force. So which is better, a job at $7 an hour or no job at $15 an hour? Most people who are in the lower paying jobs are either just getting a start, they're very young, they're learning a skill they didn't previously have, they have no references, so they're not worth all that much at the moment. But if they do the job, most will fairly quickly discover, hey, I can move on up. This is just, for now. My guess is if we were to pass a law today that says everybody in those camps have to be paid at least $15, most of those jobs would disappear. My first job, other than cutting grass, was as a theater usher, making 65 cents an hour. When was the last time you saw an usher in a theater? They used to be everywhere when I was growing up, but at the time, they were exempt from minimum wage. I didn't have to take that job. I could have cut more grass, I suppose, but I wanted it. There was certain regularity to it, and I would meet people that I could perhaps turn into friends and might open some doors, whatever, but I didn't see it as a lifetime employment. But then some years later, when the government included ushers into minimum wage requirement, that job disappeared. Gone. Almost no ushers at theaters anymore because they're private. I mean, it's not a technical job. You get people, you cut their ticket in half, and you go back and play with the lights and watch the movie. It's a place to start, but now you can't even get a start in that job because it's effectively illegal.
If anybody wants his book, there's still plenty, by the way.
Well, yeah, feel free.
Put your
I've got
hand up after I
maybe
get
enough for
your
everybody there.
question.
Once again, thank you for coming here. It's been pretty insightful. I think that understanding history helps us understand problems of today. So
Yeah.
I would ask you, what would you say to the people who are concerned about possible ISP monopolies with the removal of net neutrality?
This is not an area, I'm aware of the issue, and we have published on our website a lot of stuff on this. I would urge you to go to fee.org and type in keywords like ISP or net neutrality. It's not an area that I'm an expert in, but the economists who've written for us have argued that net neutrality was anti-competitive, and that all the disaster that was predicted when it was lifted, over a year and a half ago, none of that's come to pass. That's not a very definitive answer, but it's not an area that I'm a specialist on. We have a lot of stuff on our site. By the way, the book I have is not the one I'm talking about tonight. Excuse me, Professor. Wish I had enough of that to give everybody. This is a little one that makes the connection between liberty and character and explains some interesting real-life stories of real heroes in there. It's a little off the topic from my talk tonight.
Anyone else want to ask a question?
Sorry.
My question is similar to that one. This is from progressive cause is usually champion the exploited worker, and I was just wondering if you had thoughts on the future as far as AI and becoming irrelevance of the working force.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk today. I know that's a very pressing issue. Artificial intelligence, will it result in mass unemployment because we have robots doing work that people presently do? You know, I'm open to be persuaded otherwise, but it's hard for me not to see this as yet another manifestation of the same argument that appears every time there's some new invention. Oh my gosh, the automobile is going to put so many people out of work, and anybody who raises horses or builds carriages, I mean, we're going to have mass unemployment. What we end up doing is there are certain industries that are negatively impacted, but that's not the same as saying that every industry is negatively impacted or that there won't be new industries that arise. One of the great growth areas in the American economy of the 20th century was in vacation paraphernalia, from RVs to you name it. You know, up until about the 20th century, people didn't have time to take vacations. Productivity was so low that you had to work almost all the time, 6-7 days a week, especially if you're on the farm. But all of a sudden, with productivity soaring in the last century and the application of technology, we discovered that, hey, we can earn more and live higher and have more time available for other things, and that gave rise to brand new industries. So I'm guessing that this is the same old thing again, and we may not be able to see what those new industries are. In the 1890s, we didn't see the automobile coming around the corner. We didn't see the plane coming around the corner. You never do. These things arise when market demand and ideas merge. So I don't know what the alternatives might be, but I'm not too worried that we'll unemploy ourselves. I think people will be employed in making the robots and probably a lot of other things that we have yet to foresee. I mean, right at the moment, aren't we using technology and robots a lot more than we were 20 years ago? We have lower unemployment. How'd that happen? We have 3.5% unemployment with all these robots. It's going down, not up. So I wouldn't put too much stock in it. It's usually put forward as a way to, oh, well, now we need politicians. They can see the future. They need to map things out for us and control us, or we'll disemploy ourselves. I don't think they know anything about the future any more than you or I do.
We have time for 3 more questions. So
you've talked a bit about socialism, and we've defined that, and the title of your book is about progressivism. Could you define progressivism for us?
Yes. Progressivism and socialism have a lot in common. I think most progressives would say they are at least friendly to socialism. Many would say, yeah, I'm a socialist. They're not very far apart. But progressivism is motivated by this idea that if you get the right people and they're really smart and they are in positions of political power, they can plan and direct things, and then we don't have the chaos of the marketplace. That's the idea. And they want, in fact, progressivism has its roots in some really nasty ideas of planning. Fortunately, some of this has been shed, but the early progressives were also eugenicists who argued that government should actually make sure through its policies that people who don't have certain skills or brain power get bred out of the population. I mean, that's frightening to think of, but that's where progressivism is coming from. The central planners could be smart enough to make sure we bred properly so that we could breed out of people the bad traits. That kind of idea leads to all kinds of tyranny from the top, most notably what you saw in Nazi Germany. That would be the worst example I could think of. But that's the idea, the concentration of power in the hands of a very smart elite. That's at the core of progressivism. Some would say, well, you're superficial, but that really is, it all flows from that. think you can have the right people in power who will know how to run other people's lives.
Thank you for coming again. My question is about, well, I actually just looked at the, my question is also kind of about ISPs, so I apologize, this is not your field. But one of the quotes I saw was that competition, like, kind of kills that, this kind of like anti-consumer, like, tendencies that companies maybe should have to be even profitable. But like, I've lived in a lot of places, but there's always one thing that stays the same, that like, you can only find one ISP where I live.
Yeah.
I lived in Portland, Comcast is the only thing you can get. I live here, Cox is the only thing you can get.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say you need government regulation for that? Because it seems like there is no competition at all in these places.
Well, in almost every case where you have a single provider in a particular community, it's because of existing government regulation. The market is beginning to break that down, but I remember even in the town I lived in, Midland, Michigan, the city council thought it was their job to decide which cable provider the people of the city of Midland could get. And they were going to, by law, keep other providers out. And that's pretty commonplace around the country. But I would argue, as a free marketer, government should never do that in the first place. Now, sometimes it's argued that, oh, well, you know, it's for the same reason you can't have multiple telephone lines, you know, going into a neighborhood, or 500 different garbage companies serving a neighborhood. You know, the market tends to sort that stuff out. But the last thing you want to do is to pass a law that says this guy gets a special privilege. We'll protect him from competition. That's why you have these single providers in entire communities. You go across a political boundary and they're using somebody else because politics. Take the politics out of it. Let there be free choice and competition, and you'll be amazed at what. Never underestimate the power of what genuine competition can do. It often takes the form of somebody who's just starting with nothing but a good idea, working out of their garage, and in no time they're competing with the big guys. Just don't pass any laws that make that difficult for them to do.
One last question.
With the way that we kind of prioritize companies and governmental agencies, how do you feel that in the next upcoming years, do you think that companies could start preceding government and they start taking more power than they already do?
The companies will supersede government?
Yeah, supersede government, sorry.
Well, only if the government, it lets them, it gives them special privileges. I'm more worried about the growth of government because it's government that gives us things like a $22 trillion national debt, not private companies. I'm more worried about what they're doing. Again, I would never pretend to know the future. And if you ever come across a company, and there have been many, because they're mortal, they're people like everybody else, good and bad. If you ever come across a company that actually is breaking contracts, abusing people, not doing what they promised, committing theft or violence or deception or fraud, throw the book at them. If anything, that's what government is supposed to do. It's when it goes beyond that and says, oh, we actually want to run your business for you. We want to own businesses. We want to tell you what to do. We want to tell you how much you can pay. When it starts doing far beyond what it's capable or should be doing, that's when you have to worry. But I would just say, like Ben Franklin said of government, it's true of even every entity, public or private, eternal vigilance. Okay? Human beings are mortal, they're flawed, and there are bad ones in every sector. You got to keep an eye out for them. Try not to be fooled by them. Try not to be a victim of it. Blow the whistle if you are. And if it's appropriate for government because somebody committed fraud or violence or deception or abuse, well then yeah, it should take care of it through a court system and police and what have you. But otherwise, just creating wealth and earning customers, there's nothing about that should ever be illegal. It's actual conduct that should be illegal if it crosses that line and becomes any of those things I mentioned, like theft or fraud or force and violence. Well, hey, thanks everybody. You've been a very fantastic audience. I appreciate it. And visit fee.org and come to our conference in Atlanta if you can next June.